what libertarian law did he violate? Nothing. And to stop him and kick him out and say you got to go back to China or Africa or wherever you're coming from is preposterous. Look, if you're really afraid of immigrants, what you do is you privatize every square inch of the country. And then, if an immigrant comes in, he's trespassing without your permission. Now, that'll cut down on immigration, so you can sort of have your cake and eat it. You can have open immigration, totally open immigration, and with private property and everything, every square inch of land and water is privatized. Well, now you're going to cut down, way down on immigration because the immigrants have to get permission because everything is now owned. So I think I've covered the 4 things, and I'll stop there.
I'd like to make one little addition, maybe. Privatizing the land is one factor, and transfer payments or subsidies of any kind, I would include that. That would be like free schooling, free transport, subsidized housing, etc. So I would like to include that, and that would work.
Okay, that was too long. Let's get Jan first, and then we'll have questions.
I did mention that.
Okay, Jan?
I scarcely have anything to add because, I mean, firstly, I want to say I agree 100% with what Walter just said about immigration. That seems to me to be exactly right. I mean, anybody, like, why do we allow people to immigrate from Saskatoon to Regina, but we don't allow them to immigrate from Buffalo to Fort Erie? There's a line. Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of guys inside that line who have the power to forbid, for no reason whatsoever. The hell with them. I mean, the right basic attitude toward immigration is, if the people who own the space in question are willing to let you live there, fine. And if they aren't, you stay home. Period. End of story. And you know, my understanding of the financial crisis is exactly as they say, and I don't have a view about the monetary thing, but certainly we all, I mean, the American administration, it's just amazing how many people think the cause is something called greed. Greed. Greed is the desire for more, right? Is there anybody who prefers less to more? There might be a few, but I mean, most of us would rather have more than less. As I recall, I wouldn't mind an increase in income. Would you? Just fine. No, I mean, it's obviously administration policy that has caused the recession, and nothing more to say on that. And the only trouble we're reneging on our national debt is how do you do it? But I mean, right. So I have really nothing serious to add on this. Now, about why do Canadians believe they deserve a free lunch, that's interesting. And I think there is an answer to that question. I think the reason they think they deserve it is because they've been told that for so long by politicians who promise them a free lunch in return. The fact that what the politicians are telling them is complete nonsense doesn't seem to matter very much. So there's a need that people do things like learn a little bit about economics and a little bit about philosophy to realize that there is no such thing as a free lunch. There really isn't. Somebody pays. Any good there is, somebody has produced it. And if you think that the fact that somebody else produced it doesn't make any difference, then you are from the wrong planet.
Can I have a rejoinder? Or?
Please.
Just a few points. Well, as usual, I agree with 99% of what Jan said and with 85% of what Walter said. But I want to stress perhaps the 15% I disagree with Walter for 2 reasons. First of all, it's going to bring an interesting discussion, hopefully, between us. And secondly, this 15% is false. So let me just make a few quick points. First, about monetary policy. This Hayek triangle there is very good, except that it's basically useless to study economic policy. Austrian economists, have been have been warning of a crisis like we had 2 years ago. They've been saying this basically for 50 years. So it did happen, and they say, well, you see, we were right, and that's because of monetary policy. Now, there is a lot of problem with monetary policy, which is that, when Walter says that interest rates are zero, have any one of you tried to borrow at close to 0% recently? Well, if you try, you are in for a big problem, right? Because you are going never to be able to borrow for less than 5%, and perhaps it's going, depending on your credit or whatever, it's going to be closer to 10%. And this is because, all this ignores, I'm sure Walter is a sophisticated economist, and I'm sure you'll have a good answer to this, but let me raise the objection anyway. Well, this ignores the time structure of interest. You have short-term interest rates and you have long-term interest rates. And of course, short-term interest rates have been maintained, we think, by the Fed close to zero for actually a long time, starting at the beginning of the economic crisis. But long-term interest rates have not gone down to zero. Long-term interest rates have continued to decrease slightly as they have been on a downward trend since the early 80s. In the early 80s, long-term interest rates, government bonds, 10-year government bonds, 30-year government bonds, 50-year mortgages, long-term corporate bonds, were around 10% in the early 1980s, mid-1980s, and now they are around, 4 or 5% or something like this? Well, 3% to 5%. And, this downward trend has basically gone down, these things are more complicated than anybody thinks, actually, including me. But, so we'd have, if we look at the curve, and if somebody's interested in this curve, I've actually published it on my Facebook page and on my Twitter page. You look at the decrease in long-term interest rates over the whole period, early 80s until now, and you see a virtually nearly continuous decline with little influence from short-term rates. Now, there is some arbitrage going, and obviously short-term rates do have an influence on long-term rates, because if short-term rates are really go down and long-term rates do not, what people do is that they borrow short-term in order to lend long-term, and that's what banks are in the business of doing, actually. That's, and so the short-term rates that the Federal Reserve probably generated between the end of 2000 and 2004 certainly did encourage banks to lend, because they were able to borrow at short-term interest rates, which is their business, and lend at longer interest rates that had not gone down as much as the short-term rates. So the power of the Fed to influence long-term rates is actually much less than what we think. And Greenspan is partly right. It's only partly, but he's partly right by saying that the Federal Reserve does not influence long-term rates, and that it hasn't, and that what we've seen is a drop in long-term rate due to the flowing in of investment from developing countries like India and China, what's called the glut of the investment glut theory. Anyway, we can discuss more than this. If I really want to be provocative, I would say that contrary to Walter, I don't recommend you to read Thomas Wood's book. I think there is nothing in this book, basically, except a recantation of this sort of thing and the idea that there is only Austrian economics. You see, there are two ways to measure whether monetary policy is permissive or restrictive. Either you use interest rates, or you use measures of the money supply, M1 or M2. And it's a very complicated question, on which one you could use. The problem with Thomas Wood is that each time interest rates are more convenient for his demonstration, he claims that you measure the restrictiveness or permissivity of monetary policy with interest rates, and when it doesn't work anymore, because interest rates go into the wrong side, he uses the increase of the money supply. So I don't think this book is. So read anything, even my own book before you read it. and as a matter of fact, I would say anything that Walter wrote before you read your. I could say more about that.
Available in English, by the way.
It is published. Well, the English version is published at Palgrave, Macmillan. they sell it for such a high price that I'm sure that a few of you will buy it. But it's a good summary of these different things we are talking about as far as the economic crisis is concerned. You know, I could say more about Austrian economics, but I won't because we have other things to say, and because, you know, lots of things that Austrian economists say are useful, and I think that actually the economic crisis has shown that Austrian economics is probably less useless than what we could have thought before. But that's as far as I would go. And you know, for this question of immigration, I don't want to overdo this, you know, because lots of things that have been said by Jan and Walter I agree with, and if I was in front of a status crowd, I would probably, exaggerating a bit, say exactly what they have said. But there is one thing I should point out, you know, this question of babies. You know, the question, as Jan said, I don't think there is any reason for preventing somebody who's been born in Buffalo from living in Toronto or the other way around. You know, that's not the problem. The problem is people who come from Europe, from China, who have never had any notion of individual liberty, or of course, you know, from the Muslim countries. We have good reasons to believe that these people have been educated in such a different way than our babies have been or will be, to be much more fearful that they will be a threat to our liberties. You know, when I argue with statists and they tell me, well, immigrants are dangerous for our liberties, I always say, exaggerating a bit, which I'm sure that's what Walter wanted to do, you know, it's not only immigrants who are dangerous. If you want to look at dangerous people, just look at the average voter in America or in Canada. But you know, there is a slight exaggeration of this. Most people in Canada and in the US, especially if they are older, have been used to live, have had some idea of what it is to live in a free society. Many people in the world have no idea what it can look like to live in a free society. And it is to these people that I would be, it is about these people that I would think that it's very risky to let them decide about our liberties.
Could I say something?
First Walter, and then I think we're open to the audience. Okay.
I don't believe in tailoring my message to the audience. I tell the exact same thing, boring, to a libertarian audience or a right-wing audience or a left-wing audience, and I think it's problematic to try to promote discourse or whatever the reason is to tell a different message. I think it's problematic when you leave it at that. I think rights are more important than utilitarianism. The question is, are immigrants violating rights? And they're not. What we should do is get rid of welfare, and we should get rid of voting. I mean, women shouldn't have the right to vote, neither should men, because voting is, a futures market in other people's property or something. So if we had a libertarian society, we wouldn't have to worry about that stuff. On the monetary stuff, the Chicagoans sort of love the Fed. And I'm not that familiar with Pierre's view, but I imagine that he favors central planning of the money supply. The money supply is a very intricate part of the economy. Every transaction, except for barter, has money on one side or both sides of the transaction. One way to tell ease or non-ease of money supply is interest, another is money supply, another is the value of the dollar. When the Fed started in 1913, the dollar was an index of 100. You know what a dollar is worth now?
97.
4 cents. So we lost 96 cents out of the value of the dollar. The Fed should go. The Fed is an abomination. The Chicagoans support it. I assume people who attack Austrians and our free enterprise are the Chicagoans. I might be wrong on that. Maybe, for all I know, he's a third view that I haven't heard about.
It's a continuum.
Well, the Austrian view is that the Fed is created havoc in the economy and it should be ended. If you don't like Tom Woods' book, which I think is magnificent, another book I would recommend in this regard is Ron Paul's book called End the Fed.